Okay, so our final presenter of the conference, we are very glad to have Dr. Mark Smith joining us. Dr. Smith is Helena Professor of Old Testament Literature and Exegesis at Princeton Theological Seminary and Skirball Professor Emeritus of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at New York University. His work has ranged widely, including Ugaritic texts, Israelite religion, especially on the topic of divinity, the exegesis of several biblical books, various cultural topics such as emotions and cultural memory, Hebrew grammar, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and modern history of the field of biblical studies. His current research includes a 2-volume commentary on the Book of Judges, co-authored with Elizabeth Bloch-Smith in the Hermania series. The first volume is scheduled to appear in November of 2021. He's also working on the third of a 3-volume commentary on the Ugaritic Baal cycle, co-authored with Wayne Pittard. Dr. Smith has been gracious enough to agree to talk on the topic of the Hebrew Bible against and/or in the ancient Near East, the problems with claims about cultural conjecture. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and I've enjoyed listening in these past few hours. I know that I'm perhaps a bit of an outlier by way of many of an apparent outlier, but my wife is a lifelong adjunct faculty member. We have a daughter who is a doctoral student writing her dissertation, so many of the concerns raised today are near and dear to my own heart. Before I begin, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for the kind invitation. I begin with my title, which consists of 2 questions that reflect a conundrum in the scholarly historiography and the study of the Hebrew Bible from the middle of the last century to the present. The first one is the label Bible and the Ancient Near East. For a long time, the field has worked with the notion of the Bible and the Ancient Near East as an operating paradigm, as if the 2 terms of comparison could be taken in conjunction, but also separate, and also as entities in themselves that were comparable. The second label in my title, the Bible in the Ancient Near East, represents a response to the first. My purpose today is to unpack these 2 formulations and also to suggest their ongoing impact, both of which, to my mind, superimposes an overarching paradigm, with both running the risk of obscuring the larger picture and impeding our intellectual efforts to come to grips with that larger picture of the ancient Near East. To explain this impact, it's important to know the prior background to these 2 binary formulations. I do so not only out of a scholarly interest in scholarly historiography, it's also because even their predecessor formulation remains very much with us in the field, and that is the older formulation, the Bible versus the ancient Near East. An explicit version of this earlier paradigm versus the ancient Near East was captured in the title of an influential monograph by G. Ernest Wright while he was professor at McCormick Seminary in Chicago before moving to Harvard in 1958. Arguably a mark of its influence, the book entitled The Ancient Near East Against Its Environment, first published in 1950, was reprinted 8 times between 1951 and 1966. Wright's title captures a perspective that was not specific to the American scene. It informed some German Old Testament scholarship of the time, notably Gerhard von Rad, not to mention Israeli scholarship in its own forms, as well as captured by the work of Yechezkel Kaufman. Wright took the representations of Israel's religion in several biblical books, such as Deuteronomy, to suggest a general religious difference between biblical religion and what he would call the pagan religion of Israel's neighbors, premised on a series of binary oppositions in accordance with his book title. Perhaps most dramatic was Israel's monotheism versus ancient Near Eastern polytheism. Moreover, Wright assumed that Israel's religion was based on historical event, that's his phrase, and here he's thinking of the so-called Mosaic covenant on Mount Sinai. By contrast, the religion of Israel's neighbors was premised on their, quote, numinous awareness of nature, so a dichotomy of history versus nature. Wright also argued that Israel's God has no mythology nor sex, and he's getting this from his teacher, W.F. Albright. Now, Wright's approach was marked by four basic interlocking features. First, it assumed a massive generalization about both the Bible or Israel on one side and also about the ancient Near East. Second, it assumed a massive binary between the two. One dimension of this binary was a sharp differentiation between Canaanites and Israelites, as well as their cultures, as the Bible itself represented the situation, especially in Deuteronomy and in parts of the books of Joshua and Judges, but hardly in all parts of the Hebrew Bible. As for any similarities that might be seen of traces of borrowing on Israel's part, the biblical writers, according to Ernest Wright, quote, radically transformed all that was borrowed. Third, as a general thrust, Wright assumed the superiority of Mosaic religion over the religions of the ancient Near East. Fourth, Wright assumed that this Mosaic religion was an original dimension of Israel's religion rather than a major outcome of its own religious self-understanding, a problem that was apparent from comparing Deuteronomy with its source material in Exodus, which was lacking in expressions of monotheism. A good deal of Wright's discussion may seem naive today, not to mention massively reductionistic and simplistic, and thus perhaps not worthy of our consideration so many decades removed as we are from 1950 when he published the book. Indeed, many modifications have taken place in how the paradigm works, often allowing for ancient Near Eastern influence or borrowings at deeper levels. Still, the paradigm continues to influence scholars today, and I could name names, but I'll skip the exercise. Ironically, to my mind, perhaps even strangely, this approach has also fueled the negative critique of biblical religion on the part of the scholar Jan Assmann, especially in his claims about Israel's intolerant monotheism versus the relatively tolerant polytheism of the ancient Near East, in what he calls the Mosaic distinction. Assmann further claims, I would say without sufficient evidence, that intolerant monotheism was more predisposed to violence against others compared with polytheistic cultures. To indicate the inadequacy of the generalization, one need only point to harem warfare that is both inside the Bible and outside the Bible, or to the many Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions invoking deities in support of its massive destruction of others. Ironically, Assmann's Mosaic distinction parrots some of the flaws of Wright's approach to reach the opposite evaluation. Like Wright, Assmann gives to the voice of one biblical book and its biblical echoing in Joshua, Judges, and Kings the final say in how we should think intellectually about ancient Israel and its view of the rest of the ancient world. Assmann's work also shows, on this score, no sense of the depth dimension is Israel's religion taking place over the more than 1,000 years of biblical writings. With this background for the Bible against the ancient Near East, we may turn to the first formulation that replaced it, namely the Bible and the ancient Near East. This is the title, I think a bit ironically, of one of the Festschriften honoring Albright, and the editor was Ernest Wright himself, who offered no rationale for this title. The Bible in the Ancient Near East was also the title that Jimmy Jack Roberts gave to his 2002 volume of collected essays. He does not explicitly address the meaning that his own book title held for him, but one can see a general principle in the essays. Roberts sees, quote, strong family resemblances between the Bible and ancient Near Eastern genres. He criticized the dichotomy drawn between history and myth. He shows the inadequacies of seeing divine freedom in the Bible as opposed to magical manipulation of the gods, other gods through divination. In other words, he moves through a complex of texts in order to avoid simplification and to show the breadth of perspective in the ancient Near Eastern literature itself. In other words, he seems to gesture at giving up any simple formulation. Sometimes one hears nowadays the reformulation, the Bible in the ancient Near East, perhaps thought to overcome this problem of privileging the Bible by locating the Bible within the vast range of space and time and textual corpora of the ancient Near East. It also removes an operating assumption of general differences, even as it may allow for less general difference. This was not to deny that each culture developed distinctive traits, only that Israel was as different from another ancient Near Eastern cultures as they were from one another. Bible in the ancient Near East as a label or way of framing the question could also serve to challenge assumptions of Israelite difference on matters important to post-biblical religious traditions. For example, claims about ethical superiority of legal rulings and ethics generally in the Bible, prophetic teachings, or monotheism. Still, the label operating at such a level of generality also seems to call for an assessment of that very level of generality. It never poses the issue at the level of group comparison. In other words, it does not ask how Israel's neighbors were all similar to or different from one another, or how their seminal cultural configurations might compare. Nor did it ask how these would look in comparison to Israel. The approach in all of these rarely pits the same question for the Assyrians in relation to the Hittites or the Babylonians or the Egyptians, or to other peoples of this part of the ancient world. All of these cultures are similar and different from one another in a number of ways, and understanding Israel from a comparative perspective would depend on a far greater set of meaningful and accurate comparative data. Moreover, each of these cultures is a moving target, culturally shape-shifting as they went. In short, without a comparison of all these cultures and societies relative to one another that also accounts for their internal developments, any comparison involving Israel as one term in the comparison is meaningless. Finally, we can never get past the problem of data distribution, where we have huge resources for Egypt and Mesopotamia and rather little for Israel's immediate neighbors to compare with Israel's highly curated Bible. Thoughtful attention was drawn to several of these issues in a seminal 1990 article by Peter Machinist entitled, quote, "The Question of Distinctiveness in Ancient Israel." Machinist notes the problems in attributing monotheism to some biblical texts, but not to some texts in ancient Mesopotamia. Similar difficulties afflict efforts to locate the biblical God in that deity's transcendence relative to some Mesopotamian gods. This is sort of a claim made by a number of biblical scholars that Machinist disputes. In short, discerning Israelite difference based on a kind of trait list that, as Machinist calls it, does not hold up well, and he criticizes the approach. Distinctive configurations rather than a list of traits might be more promising, but even here Machinist raises questions, quote, "For how can we be sure that the configurations that we've discerned in the data are actually there? And even if they are there, how representative of the given culture are the data that we're using?" Thus he cautions, quote, "The history of the discussion about Israel's distinctiveness is, in sum, a cautionary tale." He notes that the issue of Israel's distinctiveness is not simply a post-biblical theological issue. Rather, it begins with the Bible itself. And I think that this is a turn that's particularly insightful to bring to bear that Machinist has done. He considers biblical statements for what he calls their common content. Quote, "They all speak of Israel or one of its representative groups or individuals, including its God, as distinct from outsiders, whether humans or gods," end quote. Machinist identifies 433, quote, distinctiveness passages in the Hebrew Bible. You got to check out his lengthy note 22, which is a great footnote. He deduces from these passages, quote, "The core of Israel's claim to distinctiveness is her special relationship to her God." Interesting pronominal use. From these 433 passages, Machinist observes that they are found almost everywhere in the biblical corpus, and that they together suggest a diversity of origin of Israel as a whole. The other emphasis in the 433 passages falls on Israel's deity, or on the people, as well as its outsider origins and origins in historical time. He believes that it was a fact and problematic of Israel's newness that lies at the heart of biblical distinctiveness passages. Israel, in effect, forged not just a distinct identity, but what he calls a counter-identity. And here he's thinking of Amos Funkenstein. Machinist ends, quote, "The Bible's very preoccupation with distinctiveness is enough to suggest that outside critics, or at least the challenges they represented, were already real to Israel from its earliest period." Now, Machinist's conclusion received a major endorsement in an important 1997 article by Ed Greenstein. And indeed, there is much to admire in Machinist's treatment. At the same time, we may be left with questions. How do we know what the deity looked like in earliest Israel? Here we may note one of Ed Greenstein's conclusions, quote, "The God of biblical Israel may not actually be very different from the gods of the neighboring nations. A relative gap in the 433 statements involves the so-called old poetry," I put that phrase in quotation marks, in the Hebrew Bible, but it's thought to be among the corpus, or some of the corpus, I should say, is thought to be among some of the older passages in the Bible. One of the signal passages cited by Machinist occurs in Exodus 15, "Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai," who is like you among the gods, O Lord. Yet Machinist himself notes the similarity of this passage to Mesopotamian expressions. Moreover, the 433 distinctiveness passages show some particular clusterings which point to a need for a diachronic analysis of these passages to see what they might really say about Israel's distinctiveness. In order to make any positive claim from what is present in these passages, it may be difficult to do little more than observe a trend emerging in the late monarchy. Many of the passages cluster in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah and in the Psalms, as well as Deuteronomy and Deuteronomically inflected texts, especially under the impact of the exiles of the northern and southern kingdoms, that arguably pushed Israelite writers to rethink its traditional religion from the 8th century on. Those distinctiveness passages in Leviticus largely fall in the Holiness Code, which is thought to be subsequent to P, and also in Ezekiel, itself a holiness prophetic work. More such breakdown is needed, as found in a fine chronological observation made in the 2012 book by Beth Berkowitz. Citing Machinist, she notes some possible intertextual influences on the holiness view of Israel's distinctiveness as found in Leviticus 18:3, which itself may reflect adaptation to, quote, "the conditions of Persian imperialism," end quote. What might be distinctive about Israel's religion is the view or constellation of self-image, as well as the apparent long process of how it came to its notion of distinctiveness, not to mention the way in which these were made to intersect by virtue of the Bible becoming a compilation of compilations. Machinist's article nicely brings out these dimensions. At the same time, his conclusion about Israel's distinctiveness itself might seem to replicate the very trait list approach that he also criticizes. And it is hard to get around the intellectual problem of discerning meaningful criteria, at least on this issue. So perhaps a scholarly hiatus on any sort of trait list would be useful. In the meantime, I would like to tinker for a moment today with an inversion of the paradigmatic binary. What the field of biblical studies has largely demonstrated since the time of Albright and Wright is not the Bible relative to the ancient Near East as much as the ancient Near East relative to the Bible. For this reason, I'd prefer to approach the issue not in terms of the Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East, but of the ancient Near East in the Hebrew Bible. This, in fact, has been the question all along, namely, what were the impacts of ancient Near Eastern cultures on ancient Israel? Now, we have to be clear that only some of the picture is available. And from that picture that can be discerned, there are any number of rather particular matters of specific impacts on ancient Israel. We might list Phoenician impact in terms of alphabet, whether direct or indirect, Phoenician traditions of temple architecture, or Phoenician month names that appear in the Hebrew Bible. Similarly, we have Aramaic loanwords into Hebrew. We also have Egyptian loanwords into Hebrew, as well as Egyptian adaptations, cultural adaptations. For example, hieratic numerals in Hebrew inscriptions, Egyptian Bes iconography and Israelite artistic representation, or the very format and theme of the Egyptian words of Amenemope in Proverbs chapter 22:17 through chapter 24:22. And parenthetically, we may note that specific cases of impact also run in the opposite direction, with a version of the biblical Psalm 20 known in Papyrus Amherst 63, which is written in Demotic characters, but using Aramaic as its language. Now, those are very specific items, but let me turn to two other cases of the ancient Near East in the Bible that I would regard as having what I would call a broader bandwidth in terms of impact on Israel. The first is Israel's own West Semitic heritage, as seen in a triangulation of the Hebrew Bible with the Ugaritic texts, Phoenician sources, and later texts such as Philo of Byblos's Phoenician history. The other case that I'm going to mention is Mesopotamian impact, apparently beginning in the 8th century with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The first case is indigenous. The second involves an invasion, or better, a series of invasions from the outside. Now, for the first, any account of Israel's literature and religion commonly backs up to the Ugaritic texts, which show some deep similarities that puts the lie to the historical claim of Israel's distinctiveness relative to the Canaanites. It is true that Israel does some interesting things. I should say its writers do some interesting things with this literary heritage, but this is something that ancient Israelites worked out over time. Stated differently, the literary and religious world of ancient Israel's earliest literature stands closer to the Ugaritic texts in many respects than it does to Israel's own later prose monarchic literature. And Israel's post-exilic literature looks like a rather different world than either of those. Now, I could dwell at great length on Israel's West Semitic heritage, but others have done this work for me. Simon Parker's 1989 book, The Pre-Biblical Narrative Tradition, provides ample illustration for Israel's narrative literature. And others, including Saul Olean, John Day, Ed Greenstein, Ted Lewis, and others, have done the same for the deity and divinity. And we also have the Dictionary of Deities and Demons relating to the Bible, in its second edition, offers a massive compendium of the relevant data. What all these works demonstrate is that the practices and beliefs associated with Canaanites in biblical literature were Israelite practices and beliefs, and that the biblical representations of the Canaanites have come to be seen in academic circles less as an accurate representation of historical reality and more as a symbol and cipher for internal Israelite polemic over both religious boundaries and internal religious constructions within Israelite society. Now, amid all of this research, the findings that really rocked any traditional theological paradigm was actually made by Frank Cross already in his 1973 collection of essays, Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic. And while the book title suggested moving the question of distinctiveness from the literary plane to the literary plane of myth and epic, the volume was actually more important for its viewpoint that would utterly explode commonly made claims of difference for Israel's God. At the heart of Cross's central claim in the book was that Yahweh was a title of the god El, known well from the Ugaritic texts and elsewhere in West Semitic literature. In other words, from Israel's earliest moment, the God of Israel was El, as in the name of Israel, not Yisra Yah or Yisra Yahweh, but Yisra El. Other scholars, including several Cross's students, would follow up his central point, Ted Lewis's massive book on the origin and character of God being a rather recent example. Other scholars would follow up Cross's point by showing that any number of specific features associated with other deities were built into Yahweh's identity as well. In other words, and arguably quite startlingly, Yahweh, whether originally an ale figure or a storm warrior god like Baal, as in the deity's oldest biblical representations, that deity, Yahweh, over time was created in the image and likeness of other gods that the Bible itself was rejecting for ancient Israel. As Cross's work showed, and others who came in his wake, this point extends to the very construction of Israel's Godhead. Now for my second major case of the ancient Near East in the Bible, and this is due to the massive impact of Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian invasions, conquest, and administration. The Akkadian loanwords in biblical Hebrew are traces of Mesopotamian impacts ranging from the military and political to the cultural and religious. It seems to extend it to other forms of culture and fusion, for example, in the Mesopotamian flood traditions, especially known from Genesis 6-9, or the Mesopotamian legal traditions, evidently reflected in the covenant code in Exodus 21-23, the treaty form of and formulations in the book of Deuteronomy, and perhaps the tradition of royal historiography, chronicle, found in 1-2 Kings. It has also been argued that the prose narrative practice as seen in the Hebrew Bible and earlier in West Semitic royal inscriptional narratives ultimately goes back to Mesopotamian royal inscriptions narrating the deeds of its kings. Prophetic literature too also shows such impact. For example, in Peter Machinus' 1983 article on Isaiah, showing the adaptation of Mesopotamian political rhetorical tropes. The insights about Mesopotamian impact extended as well to the Israelite God on any number of fronts, not only in the oneness of reality expressed in a God such as Marduk, but also the Levantine notion of the world as a series of divine inheritances of many gods, specifically 70 of them, reconceptualized as a single empire dominated by a single God. Thus, understanding the biblical God, as generally putting the phrase, is an exercise in understanding Israel's cumulative responses to its environment, whether it involved its own earlier West Semitic heritage or the impact of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. These are just a handful of examples of the ancient Near East in the Bible, and more specifically in the Israelite deity. As this discussion would suggest, what often makes Israel and the Bible seem different from the rest of the ancient Near East were not essential original features or cultural traits, but how it responded, crafting and recrafting its identity in a myriad of manners out of the traditions that it received and those additional traditions and cultures with which they came into contact. The comparison and contrast that today I've drawn between the impacts of West Semitic literature on one side and Assyrian and Babylonian literature on the other should also point toward a further deconstruction, namely of the construct of the ancient Near East itself. It too is too varied to function well as a single term within our consideration of the Bible and, or the Bible in, or whatever formulation we might be drawn to. Let me end with a short reflection on the figures in the secondary literature that I've discussed. They were almost all white males, either Protestant or Jewish. For them, monotheism seemed to be both academically defensible and religiously useful, perhaps particularly at the meeting points of certain forms of religiosity and secular education. No Roman Catholics or Christian Orthodox scholars in the field of biblical scholars have made this topic a major part of their work, as far as I know, nor have minority scholars other than Jews. I know a few women who entered this discussion in a serious way. I have already mentioned Beth Berkowitz, and I would add the brilliant scholar of Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies, and that is the lamented Tikva Frymer-Kensky, who found biblical monotheism a potential source of freedom for her as a feminist in the way that the Hebrew Bible handled divine gender. In the new millennium, interest in the topic has perhaps waned outside of some traditional religious circles. There have been occasional and sometimes tired defenses of biblical monotheism or of Israelite distinctiveness. Notably, there is the new book on monotheism by Joachim Schapper, and the discussion of Israelite distinctiveness in Beth Berkowitz's book, which I've mentioned. And I view these as positive trends. Fuel for the discussion has also come in more recent years from critics of biblical monotheism. I've already mentioned Jan Assmann and his criticisms. On the Jewish side, one could mention Shaul Magid. Assmann and Magid both have decided that biblical monotheism is the enemy lurking in the traditional theological edifices that they oppose, namely Christianity and Judaism respectively, or at least traditional forms, which they would like to see dismantled in favor of a post-denominational world. Both scholars take liberties in their criticism of biblical monotheism. Biblical monotheism serves as an emblem for what they oppose, but their discussions are lacking in proper context or texture of biblical monotheism within the Bible, and I would say in the wider ancient Near Eastern world. And biblical monotheism comes off, therefore, as a straw man or straw doctrine designed to stand in for the traditional religious thinking that these two scholars oppose. In a strange way, and yet perhaps not so surprisingly, the counter efforts of Assmann and Magid also position them as liberal theologians, counter images of the very Christian theologians or traditional Jewish thinker that each of them imagine. They are perhaps, that is, Assmann and Magid themselves, are perhaps like those very strawmen that they criticize, perhaps more so than they think. This seems to be the present of the question of biblical monotheism and other claims of distinctiveness. They are, as with so many other issues today, politicized mostly between some unimaginative traditional voices and their liberal critics offering little more than their criticism. Instead, it may be only a return to the sources of the Hebrew Bible in all its complex embeddedness in its many ancient settings, as seen in the scholarship of Machinist, Berkowitz, and Freimer-Kensky, that will break this apparent impasse and move matters forward in our study of ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. And on that incomplete thought, I end by thanking you for your patience and your interest. Thank you very much.
Dr. Smith, thank you. That was very interesting. We have no questions from the comments section yet, so if anyone does have a question for Dr. Smith, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them before we go. I just wanted to say on a personal note that it had never actually occurred to me that pitting the Hebrew Bible and Israelite religion against, maybe not pitting them against, but comparing them to the Near East as a whole, without comparing distinctive Near Eastern cultures to each other, was kind of setting you up for a failure or a false dichotomy, I guess. So that was a really interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not the only person who's made this observation. There's something along these lines in this 1997 article by Edward Stein, which appeared in one of the World Congress of Jewish Studies volumes of the Bible in the Ancient Near East.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
We don't have any questions, just people saying that this was a really interesting talk. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you taking time out of your Monday evening.
It's okay. Happy to do it. It's always a pleasure. And it's a pleasure also to learn what's going on out there widely. I live in and I work in a very sort of narrow, limited world, mostly in the very room where I'm sitting. I refer to my most recent book as a COVID book. And I think you can understand what that sounds like. It's not the most appealing thing in the world, I suppose. I hope it isn't contagious. Or it is, I don't know. But it's good for me to have heard what everyone has been saying over the course of the past few. I just want to say how much I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. David.
Yeah, sure. Well, Dr. Smith, I think we both appreciate your having agreed to present, and we hope that you'll be a part of things in the future going forward. You can certainly look for emails coming your way from me. As we say, no good deed goes unpunished.
Right. Well, that does happen now, doesn't it? I think that one of the themes that really comes out of the earlier discussion is just the deep need for huge, thick web of multilateral alliances, and it comes in all kinds of forms. And I do think that one of the things that I think that SASA and those who are here today can really open up the eyes of a lot of people who do have fairly standard academic positions, what we might say used to be standard academic kinds of positions. I add as a footnote that it took me 12 years to get tenure, and that didn't include my adjunct teaching. But that now sounds like still a pretty good thing at this point in time. So, but I think that there's a lot of educating to be done among the more established professoriate, and that your group or in groups can really contribute to that. And the fact of the matter is that all of you have a lot to contribute to scholarship. And I mean, the more important thing, and that people need to understand that. So I think that this is something like my fourth or fifth one of these in the last 2 years through various fora. And I look forward to more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're all gonna wrap up the conference now. Just wanted to hold on. Let's see, 1 second. All right, anyway. And we're going to ask everyone who's watched today to please take the survey on the virtual conference page and let us know what you thought about it, and help us understand how to do this better in the future. And I'd like to invite everybody to join myself and Megan, baby willing, baby allowing, at a virtual conference. I'm sorry. It's been a long day, long 2 days, at a social hour for the next hour. There's a Zoom link on the virtual conference page down there underneath the YouTube embedded video, and you can all follow that link and join us to chat about whatever comes up.
I know we're still recording, but I was just going to ask you, do we need to go off this link to join us?
I'll close that all up. Yeah, there's another link. It's on the virtual conference page. You go to saveancientstudies.org/virtual-conference, and you'll see it below. There's a button below the viewing screen, next to the feedback button. I'll send you a link. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
I am older than 65, so
It's okay, it's fine. And thank you, Megan, for partnering with us.